I'm very pleased to welcome you to John Halstead's talk today, which is on effective climate change and philanthropy. I think it's really exciting that we're talking about climate change this weekend, especially in the aftermath of the big climate strikes that we saw last week. And also that climate change is coming onto the EA agenda. I think initially it wasn't one of the key areas, so it's great that we have John here today to talk to us more about climate change. Before I introduce John, I'd like to remind you to post your questions on the Hoover app so we can post them to him at the end. So now, who is John? John works at Founders Pledge, an organisation which encourages entrepreneurs to pledge a portion of their profits to effective charities. At Founders Pledge, he's done extensive work on identifying promising ways to contribute to climate change, existential risk mitigation, mental health, forced displacement, and impact investment. Before joining Founders Pledge, John was a research fellow at the Global Priorities Project, and he has a PhD in political philosophy from the University of Oxford. So please join me in welcoming John.
Hi, thanks very much. So who here thinks that climate change is the number one priority for their lives? Who here thinks it's the top 5 priority? And who thinks they have a clear idea of what to do about it? Okay, well that's what this talk's about. So this is the summary of the talk, which is that climate policy, as you probably all know, is kind of failing. The most efficient solution to it seems to be highly intractable. So we need to consider how we decarbonize energy in a kind of politically tractable way. To understand what we need to do with climate change, we need to understand a bit of climate physics. So the CO2 that leaves your atmosphere, the CO2 that leaves your car exhaust and goes into the atmosphere stays there for more than 1,000 years. So what that means is that the atmosphere is a bit like a bathtub in the sense that as long as the tap of emissions is on, the bathtub continues to fill up and CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise. The challenge we face, therefore, is not to turn the tap of emissions down, it's to turn the tap of emissions off. So at some point by the end of the century, there has to be no emissions from planes, trains, ships, cars, power stations, or industry. This is a very difficult challenge, and it has to happen in the context of rapidly rising energy demand. So this is a variety of studies on projected future energy demand. The black line in the middle is the median of the models, and it has energy demand rising by 50% in the next 30 years. And there's currently 1 billion people who don't have access to electricity. As those people pull themselves out of poverty and economic growth happens, and the population increases to 11 billion by the end of the century, there's probably going to be a doubling or quadrupling of energy demand in that time. So it's a difficult challenge, and how well is it going? I think quite clearly not very well. So this is emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and you can see that they've risen pretty much unchecked, and that a lot of the recent growth has been driven by growth in emerging economies in Asia. And in fact, in the last 30 years, more than half of CO2 emissions have been emitted. So from 1780 to today, more than half of emissions were since 1990. And that's mainly due to growth in China, Asia, and India, and kind of ongoing emissions in the West. And this picture of rising emissions is kind of mirrored in the global energy mix. This is where we get our energy from. And you can see that it's still dominated by fossil fuels, which is coal, oil, and gas, which are the grey, blue, and purple slices of the chart. The low carbon bit is at the top. And you can see we have light blue, which is hydropower, nuclear, which is in red, and then solar and wind is the bit at the top that you can't see that well at the moment because it's still quite a small part of global energy. And this is kind of failure so far, and there's also failure of commitment to the future. In 2015, the world came together to sign the Paris Agreement, which pledges to keep warming below 2 degrees C. But the pledges they've made aren't consistent with that goal. And it's a very difficult goal to meet now, given how much we've emitted. Current policy commits us to at least 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And the pledges that countries have made commit us to more than 2.5 degrees of warming. So, long story short, it's not going very well. Why is it so hard? There's 2 main reasons. One being that it's a free rider problem. So states have incentives to free ride on other states, and the current generation has an incentive to free ride on future generations and pass the costs on to them. The other factor is that there's a lot of costs on special interests involved in effective climate policy. So if you wanted to reduce carbon emissions, you'd probably start by sort of increasing the cost of emitting carbon for the coal industry or for the oil industry. But those organizations are kind of politically powerful, as I'm sure you found here, and also just ordinary people don't really like increased taxes on oil and energy and that kind of thing. So this is the question: how do we decarbonize energy in this context? That's the situation we're in. What do we do about it? So it's useful to look at past decarbonized electricity systems, and these have been countries with enough natural renewable energy to meet their needs. So places with enough geothermal or hydro. So places like New Zealand, Norway, Iceland. For countries that don't have that, the only thing that's worked so far is being reliant on a mix of nuclear and hydro. So that's Sweden, France, and Ontario in Canada. That's what they've looked like in the past. What should they look like in the future? Ideally, we wouldn't have to decide. There'd be a global carbon price, and the market would choose what the lowest cost energy system would be. There'd be a uniform cost on carbon across the economy, and whatever's cheapest wins. Economists have been advocating for global carbon pricing for decades, and it's kind of widely agreed to be the most efficient solution. How's it going? Not very well. So the yellow is unpriced carbon. That's about 80% of emissions. And 20% of emissions are priced, but around half of those are priced at less than $10 per ton, which means that the global average carbon price is about $2.50, and economists think it should be $20, well in excess of that going forward. And the reason for that is driven by this free rider problem and the costs on special interests, which I mentioned before. So I think given that carbon pricing looks intractable, we have to think, what can the state do then to design a decarbonized energy system to encourage new technologies, maybe through subsidies or through some other mechanism? And I think an idea that a lot of people have is that it'll just involve intermittent renewables, so it'll just involve solar and wind. And that picture might go something like this. As they have done historically, the cost of renewables declines. So this is a logarithmic scale on the y-axis. And you can see that the cost of solar photovoltaic has fallen by about 2 orders of magnitude in the last 40 years. And then, given that, you might think that solar will provide an increasing part of global energy. So this is the exponential increase in the use of solar across the world. And you might extrapolate from there to this economy in which renewables sort of take over the energy supply. You can see if you kind of continue with this constant rate of solar and wind energy consumption, then you get to a decarbonized energy system up to 2050. I think if you look at the evidence that suggests that we actually can't do it just with renewables, I think that's an important point for anyone thinking about how to tackle climate change. And so this is the IPCC integrated assessment models, which try to map out actions we can take to decarbonize the energy system compatible with like not having warming above 2 degrees. And what you can see is that you have massive increases in solar and wind, as we saw before, but you also have quadrupling of nuclear energy. You have a massive increase, basically from zero, of carbon capture and storage, and a massive increase in the burning of bioenergy. So the models are saying that we need all of the tools available. It's useful to understand, I think, why that is. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I think a lot of people have this idea that we can just do it with renewables and energy efficiency. So let's first look at what energy efficiency can do. We saw projections of future global energy demand before. This is the correlation between income per capita and energy use per capita. See, it's not a perfect correlation, there's some variation, but you look at, get hands rosling about this and think about all these circles sort of moving across there. They're going to, India, Brazil, China, all these big emerging economies are going to be having European levels of energy consumption once they get out of poverty. There's variation. Maybe at the bottom you've got somewhere like Hong Kong, which is very dense. They've got very good public transport, so you don't need to drive. At the top end, you have places like the US, Australia, where it's like, there's a lot of driving and people fly internally and that kind of thing. But you're expecting these countries in this pack to move into the middle of the energy consumption charts as their economies grow. So then how much can renewables do? The main constraint on the scale-up of renewables is intermittency. Solar and wind don't produce electricity for days and weeks at a time. And what that means is that you need to have lots of excess capacity in the system to capture the electricity that they produce. The challenge of the energy system is to meet peak demand. If you don't meet peak demand, then there's power cuts and your electricity system is failing. So with solar and wind, you have periods of, if in a 100% solar and wind system, you'd have periods of massive excess supply, which you'd have to capture and set aside for meeting peak demand when there isn't that excess supply, when we're in deficit. And you can see here, so this is a representation of the amount of excess electricity producing capacity you'd need in excess of peak demand. So the black circle is peak demand, and then this is like 100% renewable scenarios and how much excess capacity they need. And you can see it varies from 3 to 8 times excess capacity. When you have controllable resources like gas, coal, and nuclear, you don't need to have all this excess capacity because you can just turn them on and off. And then you might think, well, what about storage? Maybe storage costs will continue to decline. So as a consequence of needing this excess capacity, you need lots of excess storage to capture the excess energy you're producing. This is a diagram depicting the amount of storage you need in heavy renewables scenarios, and the top battery shows you 1 week of energy demand in the US. And in these renewables-dependent scenarios, you need at least 2 months of storage to supply to meet energy demand. The problem with that is that it's very expensive. So if you were to meet that storage demand with batteries, you'd need more than 200 Tesla Powerwalls per household. Even if battery costs continue to fall, as we've seen them do, that's going to cost like trillions of dollars per week. And batteries aren't really designed to provide this long-term storage of like providing energy for days and weeks. They're designed to provide energy over the course of like 10 hours and less. The main storage technology we have at the moment is pumped hydro, but it's geographically constrained because you need a hill to pump the water up or a mountain. And so it's not going to work in a lot of places like the Netherlands, which are very flat. And so as a result of that, the top 10 pumped hydro facilities in the US could only supply about 45 minutes of US energy demand. Not a scalable solution. So maybe there's other long-term storage technologies that we can explore, but it seems like, given what we know about the amount of underutilized storage that you'd need, in a system reliant on renewables, you'd need so much storage that it would just, the economics could never work. It overwhelms any conceivable storage strategy. Because there's this huge difference between the peak that you want your storage system to capture and the average amount of energy that you get through day to day. So you'd only be using like 1/10 of your storage capacity. The rest you just have to waste. As a consequence of that, if you look at the economic studies of electricity systems, those that have some low carbon, controllable, firm energy supply, so that would be gas with CCS, biomass, or nuclear, have much lower costs than systems that rely on renewables alone. So this is, on the left you have renewables alone, and on the right you have where you have some sort of firm low carbon supply, and the electricity costs are about twice as high in the former scenario, which I think means that that system is not going to be politically tractable in the long term. As a result of that, I think what you can conclude is that intermittent renewables aren't going to supply more than 50% of electricity in a decarbonised electricity system. So this might sort of come off as anti-renewables. I want to make the point that I'm not being anti-renewables. I'm saying we want to push renewables as much as possible, get them to supplying 40% of energy from where they're supplying around 1 or 2% at the moment, which would be a huge improvement. But I think there's this idea that they can do it alone, and I don't think that's right. We need other tools as well. Another factor you need to consider, which is rarely considered in the climate debate, is that electricity is just one part of energy. So this pie chart shows you what proportion of energy emissions are from electricity and heat, what portion are from industry and transport, and so on. And you can see that electricity and heat is only 45% of emissions. The idea would be that once we decarbonize electricity, then we would start electrifying the rest of the economy. So we'd start having electric cars, electric heat pumps, we'd stop having like gas boilers and that kind of thing. The problem is that a big chunk of emissions, so this in these dark colors here on the right-hand side, these sectors are not electrifiable. And a lot of the carbon emissions come from process emissions in the course of making the products. So you've got heavy-duty transport, that's things like trucks, ships, and planes. You have cement, which is 8% of emissions, fertilizer, steel, 5% of emissions. All of these things rely on high-grade industrial heat, and not just electricity. And they also produce CO2 in the process of producing the goods. So what that means is that the leading technologies that we have that could decarbonize industry and transport are either carbon capture and storage or nuclear power. Carbon capture and storage is the only way to decarbonize some of these industries that we know of at the moment. And nuclear power seems like the only way to decarbonize heavy-duty transport. If you have to produce lots of liquid fuels, something that you can just run at 95% capacity and not have to try and match energy demand and meet load is going to be the best way to produce these liquid fuels like hydrogen and ammonia, which you're going to need for trucks and planes and ships in the future. So this is why we need firm, controllable, low-carbon energy. We need it to provide reliable, low-cost electricity, and we need it to decarbonize these hard-to-decarbonize parts of the economy, like industry and heavy-duty transport. The current options we have are fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage, bioenergy, and nuclear power. So this is returning to that graph we saw of what contribution these different technologies are supposed to make according to the IPCC. You can see, these numbers are very rough, but they're making kind of a roughly comparable contribution. But then as EAs, we want to think about what are the neglected tools here. And the neglected tools are carbon capture and storage and nuclear. There's lots of attention from governments and philanthropists going to solar and wind and energy efficiency, much less going to these other tools that we need, which are nuclear and carbon capture. Which means that I think one kind of early conclusion you can draw is that effective philanthropy would work on these neglected but important tools, so work on carbon capture and work on nuclear. Not to say renewables are bad, they're already getting lots of attention, so it's worth focusing on the other tools that we need. And you might conclude from this, okay, so should we just deploy the existing technology that we have? is that it's just a matter of convincing governments to take these Generation 3 nuclear plants that have been built in France and get them to build them, or to get them to build carbon capture and storage facilities. And I think the answer to that is no. The reason for that is that all existing low-carbon technologies that we have major drawbacks, which mean that they're not going to be scaled up sufficiently to decarbonize energy systems to the extent that we need. So we've seen that solar and wind can do a lot, but they can't do everything. But nuclear, CCS, and bioenergy also have a lot of problems. So with carbon capture and storage, what you're doing is adding a facility onto a gas or coal plant. You're capturing the CO2 as it's released from the flue, and then you're taking it in a tube and burying it underground. That is just pure cost addition from the point of view of producing that electricity. So to produce, you can see here this sort of gap between the red line and CCS with natural gas is just pure cost addition. You can see the gap between the green line and CCS with coal with CCS is just pure cost addition. So we need to reduce that gap. I think it's maybe doubtful that coal with CCS will ever work. It just seems too expensive. But that's the sort of drawback of carbon capture and storage. Bioenergy. So the idea with bioenergy is that you grow your bioenergy, that captures CO2 in the growing, you then cut it down and burn it, and that releases the CO2 back. The idea is that you'd have sustainable biomass that you would then grow again, and that captures the CO2, and that's what makes the process carbon neutral. It seems obvious there's kind of many risks involved in that, namely just ensuring that you have enough sustainable biomass. These bioenergy projections in IPCC models project massive increases in the use of biomass. And this has just major land use implications. You've got bioenergy competing with farmland, so probably increasing farm prices, food prices, and just competing with ordinary forests and ecosystems. The bioenergy projections in IPCC models suggest that we set aside an area of land half the size of the United States solely for the purposes of bioenergy. Probably not going to happen. The next one is nuclear. And there's various controversies about nuclear power, which I want to talk about. So the first one is that it's not safe, has too many health costs. I think this worry, while understandable given how salient the accidents are, is a bit overblown. So you can see this is illnesses and serious illnesses and deaths from each unit of energy produced by different technologies. And nuclear is at the bottom left, and you have all these fossil fuel sources which are above it. And the reason for that is that they contribute to air pollution, which kills more than 1 million people every year, but nuclear doesn't produce any air pollution, or barely any. The nuclear accidents are very salient and sort of easy to hear about on the news, but what's less salient is the fact that the fossil fuel industry kills more than 1 million people every year through waste that it doesn't manage. And you need to think about not what would the ideal low carbon energy supply do, but what's better than the kind of current system. The current system is fossil fuel reliant, so nuclear seems better than that on health basis. Another thing that people worry about is waste. How do you manage the waste in a safe way and an economical way? I think this is not that big a problem. France has been running on 80% nuclear power for its electricity for about 30 years at least, and all of their waste is stored, all of their high-level waste is stored in a facility that's about the size of 2 basketball courts. The sheer volume of waste produced by nuclear energy is small compared to other forms of nuclear waste that we routinely manage. And the fossil fuel industry produces a lot of waste, but it doesn't kind of internalize it or try and manage it. So it's again this trade-off between picking your poison. Which sort of waste do you want? Do you want the waste that comes from coal plants that's ejected into the atmosphere and that you breathe in and that kills lots of people, even in rich countries? Or do you want the waste that's managed by the nuclear industry? Another concern is that it's too slow to scale up. Again, I think this is sort of disproven by history. So this is energy scale up per person. You have at the top, you've got countries that have tried to scale up solar and wind, and so far it's been much slower than nuclear scale-ups in France and Sweden. France and Sweden decarbonized their electricity systems very quickly in the space of about 10 years because they were concerned about energy security, not because they were concerned about climate change, but they managed to do it and did it very fast. I'm sure the solar and wind things will increase a lot as solar and wind gets cheaper, but the point is that nuclear can be scaled up fast enough in principle. The main problem, I think, with nuclear is cost and kind of public opposition. Some countries seem to be able to build nuclear power plants quite cheaply and without seeing the costs escalate and seeing them overrun. So South Korea, the UAE, China have all kind of had pretty level cost curves over the last few decades. You can see on the left is South Korea. The costs it takes them to build a nuclear plant is just gradually declining. In places like the US and Europe, however, the cost to build a plant has risen over time, which is not what you usually expect in industries. You usually expect industries to get better at building their product and be able to do it cheaper over time. That's not what you find. In the US, you see this rising cost curve. You can see the red dots are those built after 3 Mile Island, and they're all pretty uniformly more expensive than the blue ones. And the other issue is public opposition. There's lots of public opposition to nuclear across the world. I believe there's lots of public opposition here, which we can talk about in the Q&A. So what this all means is that this isn't going to happen. What this graph shows isn't going to happen with the technology that we currently have. You might get it with solar and wind if the cost declines keep continuing to happen. But the CCS, increase in CCS that we need, the increase in nuclear that we need, the increase in bioenergy that we need, isn't going to happen with existing technology. So what I think that means is that the focus of people wanting to make the biggest difference on climate change should be on making the technology better. We need to improve public acceptance of nuclear and improve current technologies and lower costs, and we need to invent new technologies that don't exist yet. The aim should be to make mitigation cheap enough such that we can eventually have a carbon price. We have low carbon energy supply options that make it not that costly to impose a carbon price in a particular country. Without that, history suggests we're not going to get a carbon price and we're not going to be able to decarbonize electricity to the extent that we need to do in the next few decades. A corollary of this is that getting to net zero is a global problem. So for an Australian EA, it's about more than what can I do to reduce emissions in Australia. The focus should be on what can we do to reduce emissions across the world? How can we make the biggest impact on emissions? And that's true from the point of view of an Australian politician as well. I'd be thinking, what can I do to reduce the costs of different low-carbon technologies such that they can be spread across the world and used by other countries, helping to reduce emissions globally rather than just what's in my own backyard. And the upside of that is that it kind of overcomes this coordination problem. So it overcomes this problem where with carbon pricing, Australia would only capture a small fraction of the benefits of reducing its own CO2 emissions. But Australia could also unilaterally try to develop new low-carbon technology, which it can then spread to other regions, other countries, which can reduce emissions across the world. What's the best way to reduce these low-carbon technology spillovers? Well, there's two ways. There's deployment subsidies and there's innovation. So deployment subsidies have worked really well with renewables. They've had lots of subsidies in Europe, China, and the US, and the costs have declined really fast, like much quicker than lots of people have predicted. Again, this is that chart we saw before of declines in solar costs, and recalling that it's a log scale on the y-axis, so they've declined by a factor of 100 over the last 40 years. And the reason for that is that deploying at scale is a really good way to reduce costs. It seems like this might be the best way forward for carbon capture and storage. This is a technology we kind of know how to do because the oil industry has all the apparatus required for the different parts of carbon capture and storage. The problem is there's no incentive to do it because there's no price on carbon. So if there were ways to subsidize deployment of carbon capture technology to make the technology better, make it cheaper, make it more politically palatable to do carbon capture. We also need breakthroughs. We also need technologies that don't exist yet. These old nuclear plants that overrun and take 15 years to build just aren't going to be politically acceptable. So we need the kind of low carbon controllable options that we know about at the moment are advanced nuclear fission. So generation 4 nuclear plants that have less waste, are safer, cheaper, easier to build, which can hopefully overcome some of the public opposition to nuclear, some of which I think is actually fair. There's enhanced geothermal, which is just kind of at the conceptual stage, but the idea with that is that you dig even deeper into the ground. And if you can do that, then it's geographically ubiquitous, it's potentially very cheap, and we'd be able to control it, which is what we need to do for energy. The other option, which is further into the future, is nuclear fusion, which would be a big deal if it were to happen. Zero waste, potentially kind of limitless power, but it's this big scientific, technological challenge. But I don't think we should write these technologies off just because they're only likely to come after 2050 or towards the end of the century. Because if you look at these, if you look at the climate models, they say not only do we need to decarbonize in the next 30 years, we then need to start sucking loads of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And to do that, we're going to need a lot of energy because it's an energy-constrained process. So it's not just a matter of decarbonizing the energy we produce now, it's being able to produce loads of low-carbon energy in the future, and nuclear fusion seems like one way to do that. And then we need to consider technological solutions to decarbonizing industry and heavy-duty transport. So that's things like powering cars with ammonia and hydrogen and allowing the cement industry to capture CO2 in the process of making cement. Innovation's quite neglected. There's only about $22 billion spent on public R&D for clean energy. So a medium-sized country like Germany could unilaterally double clean energy R&D if it wanted to. And that would bring the costs of low-carbon technologies down. So it could do that for solar, could do that for these controllable low-carbon resources that we've talked about. And there's probably a case for rebalancing away from deployment towards innovation, because the economic model seems to say that at this stage, innovation is going to produce more technology spillovers. So that's the conclusion of the talk. We need all of the existing tools, including renewables, including nuclear, including carbon capture, bioenergy. But some of these tools are kind of neglected in the conversation among governments and philanthropists. So there's a case to focus especially on the highly neglected ones like carbon capture and like nuclear. And doing that by producing technology spillovers, making the technology cheaper so that it becomes politically acceptable to decarbonize. The way we've done things so far is not working. So a new approach, I think, is needed. And we also need to develop new energy technologies, things that don't exist yet, because what we have at the moment just won't do the job. There's various charities you can support that we've found, Founders Pledge and also the Let's Fund Climate Change Report recommends the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. All of these charities are working on these neglected solutions to climate change and are focusing on innovation and reducing technology costs. So thanks very much.
Thank you, John. Has anyone been able to submit questions? I just tried to submit one, but it didn't work, and I can't see any on my phone. Okay, great. Thank you. Let me have a look. The first question is, have you read studies about sequestration combined with land use or animal feed byproducts from biocrops? I've seen conflicting research on this and very positive Brazilian studies.
So the question is, say again, sorry.
Have you read studies about sequestration combined with land use or animal feed byproducts from biocrops?
Okay.
And the person said, I've seen conflicting research on this and very positive Brazilian studies.
Yeah, I've only read a bit, so I'm probably too inexpert to comment, but I've also read conflicting things about what effect biofuels have had on the climate. Sort of current guess is that people I trust seem to think that subsidizing biofuels has not been a good thing for the climate.
Okay, great. Why is nuclear relevant when the cost curve is going up and there hasn't been a single project that has been built on time in the last decade?
Yeah, so I'm not sure that's true across the world. It might be true in the US and Europe. So China quite regularly builds nuclear plants on time and on cost. The reason nuclear is relevant is because, for the reasons I laid out, we need something in addition to solar and wind to decarbonize energy. I agree there's flaws with the current technology, which is why we have to look at cheaper ways of doing it. But it's hard to see a solution without substantial use of nuclear power at the moment. If you look at the IPCC models, they're saying we need a quadrupling of existing nuclear energy. Given that lots of the old nuclear plants are going to be coming offline, that's a big problem for the climate. So we need to think what's going to happen in 10 years when these big nuclear power plants are being taken off the grid. Something that's kind of controllable and low carbon has to step in. So we need to think about what that might be.
Thank you. I'm just asking questions from different people, and I'll cycle back to the multiple questions if there's time. So the next question from Kramer is, it has been claimed by some environmental scientists, such as Mark Diesendorf, that the generation of wind energy is consistent over large geographic areas and that this significantly diminishes the need for massive storage. Do you think that claims such as this are wrong?
So I think that's making a point about if you have intercontinental transmission, then say you have like wind farms on the west coast of America and wind farms and solar farms on the east coast, you can then, because they're not as correlated as they are in one location, you can then kind of balance your supply. So I think even if, just going back to this energy system cost thing, so this is, I think even with intercontinental transmission, you still need firm, controllable, low carbon energy supply. And that's also, that's just for electricity. So all these 100% renewables models are all usually just electricity. So there's this big chunk of emissions, 27% of global emissions, which is industry, transport, areas which are harder to decarbonize. And for those, we definitely need things aside from renewables. Renewables can play some role, but it's quite marginal in these sectors. So there's room for both. I have read there's like, with intercontinental transmission, you get up to 80% renewables in some models, but there's lots of like land use concerns involved in doing that. You'd have to have like a fourfold increase in transmission infrastructure, massive increase in, solar and wind just take up lots of space anyway, so there's lots of public acceptability concerns. If we can overcome those, then that sounds like a good thing, but there's still a case for focusing on these firm, controllable, low carbon energy sources.
Thank you. So the next question is, how do you feel about solar thermal plants? They store heat energy in molten salts, which can be dispensed for 24 hours.
Yeah, I think that's good. I think solar thermal is a bit of a neglected thing in the solar debate. Most things are on solar photovoltaic. I would stress, I think we need innovation across all technologies, including solar, solar and wind. So things like perovskite solar, solar thermal are important. The point is that we need, in these heavy renewables scenarios, we need multi-day, maybe even at least a week of storage. So storage for like a day isn't gonna solve the problem.
Thank you. So the next question is, there's not enough attention has been drawn to governmental level regarding climate change and environmental issues. At the individual level, many people do not believe or recognise climate issues or environmental issues. How should the EA community allocate attention and resources to climate and environment issues for long term, let's say 5 years?
Yeah, so I think with this, I mainly looked at systemic solutions, so things focusing on like global and international policy. But it seems like things like Extinction Rebellion have really raised climate change on the agenda. It kind of remains to be seen what impact that's going to have on policy, but at least in Europe, I'm less familiar with what it's like here. People seem to be recognizing that it's like quite a big problem that needs to be dealt with. And one thing I didn't look at in my research is what impact can social movements have. So I'm kind of ill-placed to comment on that. I'm better placed to comment on the government side of things. But yeah, it might be the case that these social movements like Extinction Rebellion are also a good bet.
Just a follow-up on that, my question didn't post, but my question was, you focused a lot on technology, but I've heard arguments that technology is not going to get us over the line or it's not enough. There's other suggestions that we need to be looking at a general reduction, so this idea of degrowth, reducing the size of the economy. What do you think about those things? Like, you've just focused on technology.
Yeah, so maybe like reducing growth is one option. I mean, so trying to prevent this big increase in energy demand that's projected, this doubling or quadrupling of energy demand. It just seems very politically intractable, having to persuade to these emerging economies in Africa and Asia that they not enjoy the level of energy consumption that we in the West have. It seems like a bit of a non-starter to me. Then you can debate whether or not it's right or wrong. But I'd still expect these countries on the bottom left to move into the middle. I think it would be kind of overly risky to rely on getting them to kind of reduce their energy consumption in some way or reducing their growth.
The next question is, the rollout of nuclear power would potentially make fissile material more widely available. Do you see any nuclear proliferation concerns from encouraging the expansion of nuclear energy? Yeah,
so good question. I think it's a difficult question. So in the report on climate change, we do look at this potential connection between civilian nuclear power and nuclear weapons. We concluded that the correlation doesn't seem to exist at the moment in terms of like countries having a civilian nuclear program and then developing weapons. There doesn't seem to be a correlation there. Certainly some countries have used civilian nuclear programs to develop weapons, but the downside of having a civilian nuclear program is that the US then starts paying you lots of attention because of the treaties that are in place. So that's like a constraint on developing weapons. I also think it depends where you do it. If you increase nuclear energy in the US, I think in expectation you'd expect that to reduce proliferation concerns because it would solidify America's declining position in the nuclear weapons control regime. If the US steps back from civilian nuclear power, they basically cede the territory to China and Russia. Given that US is very strong on non-proliferation of weapons and has sort of been quite successful in that, pre-Trump, that seems like a kind of a good thing to do. The charity we recommend is advocating for expansion of nuclear in the US and the EU, and that seems to pose like quite small proliferation risks. So, as well as decarbonising energy, should we be investing more in contraceptive access and in improving girls' education levels in third world settings? Yeah, that's a good question, difficult one. So, I mean, if you look at these lifestyle questions that studies that look at what climate effect the different lifestyle decisions have, having a child usually comes out top, much more than an order of magnitude bigger impact than flying, for example. But the problem is most of the emissions now are driven by. So there's a demographic transition that occurs where countries gradually decline to having 2 births per woman, and that's the point at which it tends to come with economic development, and that's the point at which women have more control over their fertility, which is obviously a good thing, but it also means that interventions designed to reduce fertility just aren't going to have that much effect because women already have control over their fertility. And that transition is happening earlier. So India, China, there's countries at the top, which are the big emitters, have already undergone the demographic transition. The US and Europe and the EU 28 already have. Most of the places that haven't are in Africa, but that's currently a very small slice of emissions, as you can see here, just in the middle there, that blue bit. So I think the scale of you're only really affecting that blue bit of the graph, whereas what we need to do is get the whole thing. The way to get the whole thing is through technology, which can hopefully increase the political will for putting a price on carbon in the future. So yeah, I think it's and there's other obviously other considerations aside from the climate, but I think other things are likely to be better from a climate point of view.
And we'll finish on this question. Thank you so much for all of the questions. We'll go with this one as the last one, which is, which direction would you recommend someone trying to gain an in-depth and relevant understanding of climate change take? A particular degree, independent research? Do you think that formal education addresses these neglected areas sufficiently? In about 1 minute.
Yeah, so it's a big question. I think it depends on the person a lot. There should clearly be some people looking into these issues of how we decarbonize energy. I'm trying to think of something worthwhile to say. I mean, the knowledge is kind of out there. You can go away and kind of go on Sci-Hub, which is illegal, I don't endorse, but you could go on Sci-Hub if you so chose and find all these papers on climate economics and that kind of thing. The Clean Air Task Force has lots of research papers on their website about the decarbonisation challenge, which are very informative and worth a read. But yeah, not much good to say about that.
Thanks. Well, you can think about it tonight because John's office hours are tomorrow morning at 11. So you've got about 9 hours. And for all of the other unanswered questions as well, you can see John then. Thank you very much for coming to this session. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Please thank John.